Hi, good morning, everybody. Good morning. My name is Chris Scott. I work for Outdoor Recreation Northern Ireland, and we deliver the Secretariat services for the Visitor Safety Group. So you're all very welcome today to the inaugural VSG webinar on COVID-19 recovery planning. Normally we do this by physical face-to-face workshops. We have a number of workshops, one in Skipton Castle in March and another planned for the Isle of Man in June. Unfortunately, we had to postpone those, obviously, given the current circumstances. But we're really keen to make sure that we continue to provide value for our members. So at this time, we're doing it via webinars. We decided in this, given the crisis that the countries and the sector is in, the VSG board and ourselves as Secretariat, we're very keen that we open this to non-members as well as full members within the industry, which is why the guidance that was published last week is free and open for everybody to use, and indeed this webinar as well. So we had 295, in fact nearly over 300 people had registered for the webinar over the last couple of days, so we've been quite overwhelmed by the support, and I can see everybody slowly getting themselves online now. The vast majority have managed to get on, which is great, and we've all our presenters online, which is even better. It's great to see representation from across the UK and Ireland, from public, private, voluntary and community sectors. About 45% of those registered are from member organisations, and about 55% are from non-member organisations. So member or non-member, you're really welcome, and hopefully this session will be very useful. So Alan, if you just move on to my next slide there, please. Just back one there, Alan. Just to chat you through the running order, first of all, we've got about an hour and a half today. We aim to be finished at about 12:30. So I'm going to pass on shortly to Ken Dodd, who's the VSG chairman, just to provide a further welcome. And considering there's 55% of you are not VSG members, we'll give you a brief introduction to VSG and what it's all about. I'll then pass on to Nick Hall, who's the HS&E manager for the Woodland Trust. Nick is a VSG board member, and again, one of the key architects really of this COVID-19 recovery planning guidance. So Nick will give you an introduction to the guidance itself. There are 8 sections within the guidance, amounting to 32 pages and over 100 different bullet points of information. So it simply wouldn't be possible for us to cover those within an hour and a half. So we focused on 4 sessions, and we've asked Dave Liddy to give us a session on assessing sites. Adele from WWT is going to do a double header and talk about general safety measures for staff, volunteers and contractors, and also moving on then to engaging people. Nick will come back then and talk us through outdoor visitor infrastructure, and then we will do a questions and answer session at the end. But you also have an opportunity, if you just move on to the next slide, Alan. You also have an opportunity to ask questions as the webinar progresses. So if you look at the top corner of your screen there, there's an example on the screen at the moment. If you click there, it'll open the questions and answer pane, and you can ask questions as we go through. Some of the presenters online have access to those questions, and they'll be able to provide answers for you. I'll also try and group some of the answers together as we go through, so we can have a good session of Q&A at the end. You can help me though by making sure, keep an eye on the questions. If somebody has asked a question that you would like to see the answer to as well, you can simply click like, a bit like you see on Facebook. So rather than typing the question out again, just click on that, and as those group together, it'll show me which are the most popular ones. And then after Q&A, we'll pass back to Ken for a quick close. So without further ado, I think we've a good number online there now. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Ken. You mightn't see Ken's face. Ken's joining us on the phone, and Ken's just going to chat us through an introduction to VSG. Thank you. Over to you, Ken.
Okay, well, particularly warm hello to those coming across VSG for the first time. First slide, please. The group was formed around 22 years ago to come up with some principles to guide what was then a new branch of risk management, visitor safety. We wanted to find ways to encourage people to visit with acceptable levels of safety, but only using risk controls that didn't spoil the beauty and quality of the landscapes and properties that were attracting our visitors in the first place. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. We now have over 60 members, and I've got some logos showing who they are. If we can have the next slide, please. Over the years, we built up to membership of throughout UK and Ireland, as you can see. There's a slight lag, I'm afraid, on the timing between my landline and the slides coming up, so apologies for that. But as you can see, we've got a wide-ranging network now covering forests, woodlands, nature reserves, national parks, country parks, all the major navigation authorities, most inland waters, lakes, many water companies, owners of historic buildings. So we can draw upon skills of individuals who welcome and manage visitors on an everyday basis, managers who specialize in visitor risk, and we have direct lines of communication with key policymakers. Next slide, please. A key characteristic of the group has always been the way members help and support each other. And to facilitate that, we are developing a new and improved VSG website that's near completion and we're going live soon. And a feature over the years the group's been in existence has been workshops which are hosted by members free of charge to attend, and we run probably 8 to 10 workshops a year. Because of coronavirus and COVID-19, we've had to postpone 2 of these so far. In April, we should have been in Cornwall looking at risk in Tintagel and Pendennis Castle. And later this month, we were scheduled to visit the Isle of Man for the first time. Disappointed not to be able to see how the Isle of Man copes with hundreds and thousands of bikers descending on the island for TT week. But never mind, we aim to run these next year, so it'll be possible to revisit Cornwall and visit the Isle of Man again. The photograph that's in front of you is of a VSG visit to Skellig Michael, a tiny island off the west coast of the island of Ireland. It's a World Heritage Site managed by one of our members, the Office of Public Works. OPW wanted expert opinion and peer group review of their risk management decisions after a couple of fatalities to American tourists on the island. Star Wars fans will actually know this island because it featured in episode 7, The Force Awakens, and that in itself has given rise to a whole new set of problems for OPW and the need for a new risk assessment for a completely different sort of visitor attracted to the island compared to those seeking the monastic solitude in the little cells that are on top of the island. While workshops are cancelled, we're going to be hosting, next slide please, more webinars and have increased the frequency of our electronic magazines. The other thing that the group's very proud of doing was producing good practice guidance. The first book we published was in 2003, and that dealt with risk, managing visitor risk in the countryside. And the book illustrated in the centre was a variant, the same principles were applied, but a variation for managing visitor safety in the historic built environment. Since we published the first guidance in 2003, we've sold over 8,000 copies of these 2 key publications, and that's circulation on top of the PDF copies that are freely available to our members. So we know that our principles have been widely circulated, not only to landowners and managers, but we know the book's been bought and used in most government bodies and agencies, local authorities, many universities, colleges, commercial consultancies in management, training, safety, law, engineering. So the principles are being pretty widely spread. The other publication on this slide, of course, is the one we're going to talk about today, our new guidance on COVID-19. Like the other guidance, it draws from the wide breadth of our membership. Of course, COVID-19 coronavirus is a new hazard, so none of us had experienced it before. Nevertheless, we know that a strategy produced by a team is almost always more effective than strategy written by an individual. Next slide, please. I'm going to hand over now to Nick Hall, a VSG board member, who will explain more about the team that has produced the COVID-19 guidance and how it's been applied.
Okay, Nick, it's Chris here. Are you with us okay?
Can you hear me now, Chris?
Hi, Nick, is your microphone on? Oh, there you are. Good to see you. Yeah. So we'll get you up on screen. Your first slide is on there, and we'll pass over to you to give us an introduction to the recovery planning guidance. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Chris, and good morning, everybody. Yeah, a little bit of background, really. In terms of the Woodland Trust and where we are, we're probably in the same boat as everybody else. It's been a very challenging few months, and we've had a lot of things to deal with, a lot of issues, and we're just starting to feel our way back into some semblance of normality. And this guidance going through this process was incredibly useful. In terms of our organisation, just so that everybody's aware of what we're actually doing, all of our offices remain closed, all of our actual properties and our hubs and visitor centres and things like that. Our volunteering is just starting to come back, so we're reintroducing single volunteers, volunteer wardens, and people that can be socially distant when they're actually carrying out their volunteer duties, like people checking on dormice and things like that. And a lot of our staff remain on furlough. In terms of our estate actually remained largely open throughout the entire last sort of 2 months, although of our 140 odd car parks, quite a lot of those were shut. Almost all of those are now reopened. So we're in the same boat as everybody else, and that's one of the things that led to this guidance. I think right from the start of this episode of this pandemic, one of the things I'm very, very keen on is collegiate working. So I've always liked to share what I'm doing with my peers and people like Adele, who's running this event with me, and to bounce things off people. And that's really sort of where the guidance document actually came from. Right from the word go, a bunch of us started talking to each other on a regular basis, sometimes daily, about how we were dealing with the pandemic and how we were managing different issues and what our working practices were, and sharing. And it was that sharing that kind of led to this document. I think the second point on my slide there, COVID-19 is uncharted territory. I think that's incredibly true. And the reality is no one really knows what they're doing. There's no perfect answer. We're feeling our way through this. And I think for everybody on this call, I think that's an important message. Nobody is expecting everything to be perfect. It's about doing the right thing, stepping back, thinking, allowing ourselves time to manage risks and do risk assessment and so on. I think the regular safety chat evolved into the document that you've all actually seen. And I think one of the key moments that enabled it to be actually created was when a colleague and friend of mine, Andrew Sharkey, our UK estate manager, when he went on furlough, he couldn't obviously volunteer for the Woodland Trust, that wasn't permitted in the rules, but he could volunteer for the VSG, and Andy very kindly got stuck into writing a lot of the text and content for the document. Next slide, please. That just gives you an idea of the organisations that actually contributed to the document. And something Ken said before about drawing on the breadth of experience. Those are a whole range of organisations, including the Woodland Trust and myself, that came together and discussed the document. And the way it actually worked was Andy and myself worked on the core content, and then it went in front of this amazing working group, and we received lots of comments. In actual fact, the comments were probably the hard part. It's very easy to sit and just write something. It's very hard to then get hundreds of comments back that you have to interweave into it. But I think it worked really, really well. And as Ken said before, something produced by a team, I think is, yeah, it's a lot more effective. What is interesting about that slide as well, and it's something I'm really, really pleased with, is that's not just VSG members. There are organisations and individuals on there who are from outside the VSG that joined in, and I think that's absolutely brilliant. I think that was a great thing. Okay, next slide, please. I think on there, the top point is very, very important. As we start feeling our way through this and start waking things up and bringing back volunteers and opening properties and getting ourselves back on track again, I think the really, really important thing is that any decision needs to come down to safety. Yes, there are commercial reasons, and yes, there are motivating forces that could be pushing us, but we should be confident to stop, pause, think, and make sure we're doing it safely. I think landowners and managers, I think you need to take the time to think about how you're going to do things. You need to look at what other people have done, you know, read the guidance, learn from experience, share with other organisations, and then come up with a plan that you're confident in, come up with systems that you're happy with. And like I said before, it doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be right every time, but you should be comfortable in what you're doing. And I think the last point on there is about communication. I think the really important thing is as you go about waking up your organisations, as you go about getting things back to normal, whether you're bringing volunteer groups back in or whether you're opening an office, it's about letting people know what's happening, letting people know what the new rules are, letting people know what the new landscape is, and so on. So internally, for example, here in the Woodland Trust, we have regular updates coming out from our CEO. I regularly update the organisation, send information out. We're updating volunteers and so on, and letting them know what's happening. And I think it's important just to be honest and be very clear on what needs to be done and what the new workplace effectively looks like. Next slide, please. Sorry, 1 second. Sorry about that. I didn't actually follow the rules and forgot my home phone, but that's now turned off. Where was I? Okay. The basis of the guidance that we put together is one of the sort of main principles of the visitor safety group, and that is the risk control matrix. Now, this is the way VSG guidance works in terms of how you manage hazards actually on your site. And what you've got here is the visual representation of that. Now, effectively, what it comes down to is the more remote your site is, the less developed it is, the further away from civilization, the more that risk is actually acceptable on there. And we expect people to be more self-reliant and take more care of themselves. Conversely, as you get back to more developed sites and more closely into civilization, where there's a wider variety of people going to access it, it's reasonable to expect us as landowners to do more. And this formed the basis for how we approach the COVID-19 guidance. I do, however, think the most important two words on that entire diagram in front of you are right in the middle of it, and it says personal responsibility. I think that's a message for all landowners in that we should do what we can to manage risks. Like I said before, we should assess them, we should be confident in what we're doing, but every single person in the UK or Ireland or in the world has their own personal responsibility for actually taking care of their own safety and of the people next to them. The concept of social distancing, following site rules, following one-way systems, keeping our distance from people, those are things we all have to do. And I think as landowners we should remember that. We shouldn't try to be all things to all people and try and do everything at the same time. Next slide, please. I think there's some important points on there. As you read through the guidance, you'll find that there's some sort of central pillars that we all need to do. And the first one is enabling social distancing. Whether you're opening an office or a visitor centre or a museum or a zoo or even a woodland car park, the idea that we should enable social distance, we should enable people to do what I've just been talking about, which is to take reasonable care of themselves and others, that's really, really important. So whatever we actually put in place, whatever plans, whatever risk assessments, social distancing should always be the main part. Yes, we may need things like masks for first aiders and stuff like that, but actually it's social distance that's important. I mentioned this before, information, safe ways of working for staff, volunteers, visitors and contractors. Let's give people the information they need. Let's make sure there's a clear, safe way of working before we bring back volunteers or before we welcome staff back in or let visitors through the door. Let's make sure we've got clearly communicated processes. The last one is hygiene. Let's make sure that our hygiene facilities are suitable. Let's enable people to be clean. Let's enable people to follow the government messages, and that may require changes. So, for example, here in the Woodland Trust, we're actually encouraging staff when they do start going back out to take water and soap and a towel with them to clean their hands so they can get washed up. We're going to provide more hand sanitizer. When our headquarters opens, there's actually going to be sanitising stations knocking around the place, and it's going to be things like when we actually have deliveries brought in, they're going to be cleaned and disinfected before they've actually moved into the main office. So those are the kind of changes that we've been looking at making. Next slide, or is there one more?
Great, Nick, that's you. Thank you very much, and very coolly dealt with the phone there. That was obviously somebody phoning you to tell you, did you know you were on the internet talking to 300 people. All the other presenters are furiously diving around their house and ripping out telephone cables, I'm sure, as we speak. So very well dealt with. Very well dealt with.
Thank you.
We should also say as well, just before we cue Dave here, that this webinar is being recorded, so that will be going live, or will be going on our YouTube channel. You'll be getting an email about that either today or tomorrow morning. So if you've missed some of the start, you can see there's nearly 230 people online at the moment, which is great. But if you missed some of the start or some of it's dropped out for you because of broadband issues, etc., then you'll be able to watch it back on YouTube, which is great. I should also say, just as a caveat as well, you probably heard Nick mention the phrase social distancing there a few times. One of the challenges of doing a piece of guidance that has to cover the UK and Ireland is different terminology, different approaches to the COVID-19 crisis, and I think so when you hear social distancing, please, if you're in Scotland or the Republic of Ireland, obviously we mean physical distancing, and again, each country is taking a different approach, different interpretation, and operating at different speed. So I think it's important you take that in context of your own country's approach as well. So we're going to move into some of the detailed sections now after those introductions, and hopefully, Dave, you're there.
Can you hear me, Chris? Yeah,
I can hear you loud and clear. That's great. Dave's joined us from North Wales, and anywhere beautiful like North Wales, the broadband signal is inversely proportionate to the beauty. So you mightn't see Dave, or in fact you won't see Dave, but you'll be able to. He's joining us by telephone, so you'll hear us. You'll hear him online. So Dave, your first slide's up. If you cue Alan, I'll let you continue on.
Okay, good stuff. Thank you, Chris. So Dave Liddy, I'm the Recreation Safety Advisor for Natural Resources Wales. Wales Devolves Administration, we're still in red. We've got a traffic light system going on here. So we've only got 5 miles of local travel. Now, all of the NRW facilities are currently closed. Our mountain bike trails closed, car parks, visitor centres, and the popular saying is that Wales is closed, during COVID, and that's exactly where we are. We're expecting our next announcement here on the 18th or 19th of June by Mr. Drakeford. And as you're looking forward, it's certainly worth people in Wales looking for that Welsh Government guidance entitled Unlocking Our Society and Economy, Continuing the Conversation. In there, pages 13, 14, 15, you get a really good look at the Welsh Government's proposed traffic light system, and you'll be able to interpolate that into that, what it will mean for you and your circumstances. It divides those traffic light systems into a series of different streams, and that's all very, very useful. We might move to amber status Monday 22nd following Mr. Drakeford's announcement, but we'll see how that goes. Opening your sites, your decision, as Nick said, it's going to rest with your local managers, and it should only be happening when you think it's safe, really. You want to start off, again, as Nick said, thinking about where those sites sit on that risk control spectrum. There's a great deal of social distance guidance out there, but not all of it's going to apply everywhere. And it remains for managers to think carefully about the local context of their site, their organisation that they're putting it into. At the undeveloped end of the spectrum, you know, it's easier for managers. We're expecting visitors to take responsibility for themselves. And as managers, we're not actually going to have to do a great deal. That's kind of handy. Regardless of location, make sure your existing risk assessments, your inspection regime, that you're all up to date with that stuff. Yeah, you've got to do that before you start thinking about doing any COVID-specific stuff. Make sure your existing systems are all in place, your control measures are still working and fit for purpose. Now, there may be changes that have taken place during lockdown, and that might mean things have happened on your site that you're going to need to think about, that you're going to need to put right and fix before you reopen. That's just all your standard stuff. Before you've even started thinking about what you're doing extra, just get the basics right and do that. You know, get those basics right. Okay, if we want to go on to the next slide, please. I've got 3 examples here for you that kind of illustrate some of those other sites on the spectrum. At the beginning, we've got a very simple, lightly developed site. We're in Snowdonia National Park here. We've got a very simple 4-space car park site. Yeah, we're moving on with the slides. We've got a few picnic tables, nice grassy riverbank for the kids to play on. But this is up a single track road. You know, we're 5 miles outside Bala, which is only a small town, maybe 4,000 people. We're definitely at the lightly developed end of the spectrum. Yeah. So when we've done the standard facility inspections here and any remedial work and possibly cut the grass, as you can see, nobody's been here for a little while. You know, we should be able to go back one, please. Over here now, we should be able to remove those closed signs and declare that very simple, lightly developed site open. All we're going to need to do will be to remove the closed signs, put up some welcome back, social distancing reminder signs. Yeah, is all that's going to be required. Yeah. So you can imagine little car parking spaces off to the left with some closed signs. Change those for the welcome back signs. We've got some nice social distancing behaviour stuff about keeping your distance and all that. And that's about all that's going to be required here. We're at the lightly developed end of the spectrum. Now, where NRW staff have got a lot of sites in their patch, I know people are going for some kind of a checklisty kind of approach where, because it's really important that we've got records for each site. So they've developed a simple checklist. They're going to visit each site, tick, 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 and then at least we'll have a record that we visited those sites and they've decided that, you know, they're fit to open and that we're happy with any, you know, that you can imagine at the bottom there's a text box and he's saying, you know, do you think we can open it in this state? Are there any other little things that we might want to do? It might look a little bit tick boxy, but it's quick and simple for staff who've got a lot of those lightly developed sites to get around and open. Final question in that tick boxy thing is, do they need to remove any barriers to allow access? You know, are there any minor fixes required? Are there any touch hotspots? And they might want to think about, you know, do we just need to tie that gate open? Just simple things. So at the simple, lightly developed end of the spectrum, we're doing simple things. The odd sign, the odd gate. Okay, if we move forward again onto the next slide. The next slides are moderately developed sites. Yeah? This is in the Clwydian Range area of outstanding natural beauty. And this is a popular, very popular access point from which to climb Moel Famau, the mountain. We'll have about 1,000 people passing through that car park every day. You can see the space on the right of the slide there for about 100 cars through a pay-on entry barrier. Just behind me with the camera was the toilet block. You can see through the trees there's a play park. Definitely moderately developed part of the spectrum. So standard risk assessment and inspection before opening, we're definitely going to need those records. Yeah? But we're going to need a much more detailed assessment of the site to take place before we can open here. We're thinking about a map recording pedestrian flows, where we think people are going to go, where the pinch points are going to be, and then we're going to transpose that map into something that's going to indicate what we're going to need to do and what's going to happen, where we're going to need one-way systems, where the potential places to widen are, which obstructions we might need to remove just to create a more space. Because what I'm recommending to staff is a kind of method statement approach. You know, what's going to be open, what's going to be closed. You know, the play area in this instance will probably be closed. And as we move from red to amber, maybe the toilet block will have to stay closed in the short term. That's not always very desirable, where you've got people who've always got the other things that go with them. And, you know, importantly here, we'll be working with our partners on this site, with Denbighshire Countryside Services, and we'll jointly come up with that method statement about what we're going to do, what we're going to close. You know, are we going to have a one-way up, one-way down? How we're going to move through the different areas of the site. So we're going for a method statement. How things will be organised, what will happen, where things will be, who will do it, who will check it, and then we're going to follow that up with a COVID-specific risk assessment, which will supplement the original risk assessment for the site. How information will be provided to visitors will be crucial. Before they arrive, we're going to have stuff on websites and social media. When they arrive, we're going to have some big banners and some big diagrams that they can see out of their car window, making it obvious that things aren't going to be the same as they arrived last time. And then in detail on the site, we're going to have signs and arrows. A similar format to all that information and signage, joined up appearance will be good. And so we'll have our own comms team, some design and interpretation specialists, local site managers, partnership organisation, all in that organisational chain, getting that site ready, getting that information ready. Next slide, please, for the visitors when they arrive. Okay, my final slide is about Coed y Brenin. Now, this is Natural Resources Wales' flagship visitor site, southern end of Snowdonia National Park. You know, something around 200,000 visitors a year. Car park, visitor centre, shop, information point, cafe, bike shop, play areas, you know, mountain biking and walking trails. This is Coed y Brenin, definitely the heavily developed end of the site here, and you can see our lovely buildings there. That must be very early in the morning before people are arriving. Now, our recreation team here will be getting advice from NRW's health and safety specialists, absolutely no doubt. As the COVID status in Wales, that traffic light, you know, red, amber, green changes, more of this site will come into use over time. The method statement, and there's going to be a series of method statements as the status and the site changes, then that method statement is going to have to be clear, going to have to be changed. So you can imagine that status red, we might just have the car park open, and we might just have the outside toilet, you know, on the left of that slide open, and we'll have to think carefully about whether we're going to have paid car parking. And the method statement is going to be clear about saying what's open, what's not, what the pedestrian flows are going to be. A clear plan will have to indicate how visitors flow around the site, you know, how they're going to queue for the toilet, how they're going to queue to pay for the car parking. And then as the site status changes, we're going to have to think about, well, can we open the cafe? Can we do takeaway food? How are we going to facilitate queuing, payment, exit? Where are going to people stop to eat? All going to be detailed in that method statement. COVID-specific risk assessment will concentrate on the social distancing measures being put in place. We have tried, you know, mashing all of those social distancing measures into our existing risk assessment. And it seemed to make more sense to have a big statement in a risk assessment about how the site was going to be organised, and then you can do a risk assessment, and then you're talking about the things that you know about, because you know where the people are going to be. You've then got a picture. So method statement first, plan what you're going to do, then you can come back and make sure with a risk assessment process that you're putting adequate social distancing measures in place. As we move along that risk control spectrum, from lightly to more heavily developed, we can expect to do more to encourage and enforce those social distancing rules. Okay, if we go back a slide, please. I just wanted to finish going back to Coed Mol Famau. Now that's in itself, it might only be a moderately developed site, and we have a plan for how we can do things there. However, that might be one of those honeypot sites in Wales, along with places like Snowdon, like Cadair Idris, and like Pen y Fan, where the number of visitors and the nature of them, because we get a really interesting, and I'm sure you all kind of know what I'm inferring there, interesting visitors turn up there, and it might just be impossible to keep them safe and ensure that they've got good social distancing. You know, when we move from red 5 miles into amber, and we don't know what the travel limit will be in amber, but we're expecting a huge influx of visitors, you know, from northwest England, and that can just bring this whole site, the country lanes, the whole place into gridlock. You know, when we get snow, everybody from Liverpool thinks, oh, let's go sledging on Mol Famau, turns into a nightmare. But that might mean at honeypot sites like this, that it's appropriate for NRW to take a decision to keep the sites closed for longer and wait for the status to change. You know, maybe from amber to green, maybe from green to, you know, beyond the traffic light before we reopen that. And so those are the sorts of processes that we're going through in NRW. And you can see we've still got some important decisions to make as we get updates on the status, that red, amber, green, and that how we as managers make our decisions about the sites based on whatever the current state of local government guidance will be. Okay, Chris.
Great, Dave. Thank you very much indeed. A very logical approach there between the lightly, moderately, and heavily developed. But of course, you know, as you say, focusing on that case-by-case basis as well as each site is important to be considered at a local level. So thank you very much for that. And of course, more guidance around assessing sites within VSG publications, and indeed obviously the COVID-19 recovery guidance. So I'm now going to pass over to Adele. Are you there, Adele?
I am. Good morning from Bristol.
Great. Good morning from Bristol indeed. So Adele, you've volunteered to do a double header for us. You're going to talk about safety measures and engagement. So your first slide's up there. Alan will cue your slides as you ask, and we'll try and get you up on screen, and we'll go from there. Thanks, Adele. Over to you.
Lovely, thank you. Morning, everyone. So I work for the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. We've got 10 sites in the UK, plus we've got people who sort of travel all around, including internationally. Our 7 sites that are in England are opening next week. We announced that to the public yesterday, so that was an interesting experience. And then we're awaiting for when we're going to be reopening our site in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Next slide, please. Okay, so firstly, I'm going to talk about our people. So when I'm talking about people, I mean staff and volunteers. There is a bottom line with this. So there will be some people who are not returning to your work site at the moment. So you need to have an organisational position on that. So for ourselves at WWT, those who are shielding themselves or a household member are not coming back yet. They need to stay shielding for the moment. But we have said that people who are in the vulnerable category may return. However, we're doing person-specific risk assessments for those vulnerable people to make sure that it is safe for them to return. So there's a whole load of work that needs to be done around what are the needs of your people, How much time do they need? Are they worried about returning? Please don't underestimate how long some of that can take. So what we did at WWT is we sent out a online sort of survey monkey type thing, and it went to the staff and volunteers, and it went through can they work at home? Do you have caring responsibilities? Do you have any other concerns about returning, sort of anxiousness, those kind of things? What form of transport will you be using? So are you going to be going on public transport, which is a particular concern at some of our sites, including our London site. We have noticed some people being really, really open and honest with us around concerns that they've got. As many of you know, there has been some concerns around mental health during lockdown. So we need to make sure that our people are okay, whether they're not coming back or whether they're coming back. We need to be speaking to them. And then certainly with the volunteers, are you willing to return to duty if we offered that opportunity for you? So all of that went out. We had a really, really good response rate. People are really keen to get back, which is absolutely fantastic. But then those individual results now are forming conversations between staff and volunteers and line managers as to who's coming back, when they're coming back, what their role is going to look like, those kind of things. Now, obviously, the information in the survey is highly confidential, health related information, some of it. So it needs to be dealt with appropriately under GDPR, and also you need to make sure that, for example, there's not any discrimination. So if somebody's got a long-term health condition, we need to treat them appropriately. So that's just a heads up with that. Next slide, please. So now we've decided who's coming back when. We need to make sure that they are given that information, training. So as I mentioned, some people are going to be really nervous about coming back. Some people might be the complete opposite and are totally blasé. We were quite lucky, actually. Our e-learning provider has done a really good short package on returning to the workplace, which all our staff and volunteers are going through. And then they're doing site-specific training, so going through what the expectations are, if there's any changes to people's role, what it looks like on site. People who've been furloughed or not volunteering have been away from the site for months and months and months, and the site looks very different. They're not coming back to what they knew before. So there needs to be really key messages around that as to what people can expect, having a walk around the site to really get their heads around it. And then obviously going through what the organisational and the site risk assessments say. So again, everybody's getting the same information. They understand how they fit into all of this and what their responsibilities are. I just think it's really, really important that it is this new norm, really. For some people, that's going to be quite a shock, and we need to support those people. We need to think about our different form of communications. I'm sure many of you attending today have got multiple sites. You've got staff, you've got volunteers. They all need to be communicated with in slightly different ways. So don't just whack something on your intranet site and assume that everybody's going to read it, because some people can't or won't be accessing. So think about how to get those comms out. Also, you might have seen from the health and safety executive around high risk training tickets. So if you've got people who've run out of date for first aid training, chainsaws, tractors, all of those kind of things, making sure that you've identified those people and checking whether you're happy to grant an extension for their training tickets. And then thinking about when you're opening your sites, around first aid provision, fire wardens, those kind of things. Have you got enough people to open safely? Next slide, please. Okay, so again, the other bottom line is there is no let up on this. COVID-19 is not going away. we need to make sure that there are proper processes in place. That little picture that's on there, that's actually taken from our intranet site, so people can click on there. They can open up all the information that we've been putting on there. So there needs to be really clear information to staff and volunteers that if they start to experience symptoms, they need to continue to self-isolate. We're doing fitness to work checks before first day back. So either the day before you come back or just as you walk through the door, you have to sign a fit to work check to say that you are fit and well, and that you don't have an active fever, for example, and that you're okay to be on that site around colleagues and then the public. You need to make sure that you've got processes in place for deep cleaning. So if somebody is identified within your teams as becoming positively tested for COVID-19, that you've got those deep cleaning procedures. And of course, all the contact tracing or track and trace is just coming online now. It seems to be if you've been in close contact with somebody for longer than 15 minutes, that seems to be when it alerts. But it is useful to have your rotas, your staff and volunteer rotas, written down. So if somebody is identified as coronavirus positive, you can actually track back for the last few weeks who that person has been working with. And that's particularly important if you've got people who, due to their work tasks, are having to breach social distancing. Next slide, please. Okay, so with your first aid procedures, you need to have an organisation statement on this. Organisations seem to be doing it slightly differently. So what's your position? So is it the legal minimum, which is to provide first aid support to your staff and volunteers, or is it that you're going to also provide first aid for visitors, so over and above the legal requirements? So at WWT, we decided that we were going to provide first aid to the public. So most of our first aid is quite minor, really. It's a wipe and a plaster. We have identified that if it is a more serious first aid incident, it may be that the first aiders have to breach social distancing. So that has got to be risk assessed. You've got to put processes in place. For example, personal protective equipment. None of our vulnerable staff who we are able to bring back to work under a risk assessment, none of them will be on the first aid rota, for example. It's too high risk. You also need a procedure for CPR, so have a look at the Resus Council guidelines. There's a link in the VSG document where it goes through the procedure for no mouth to mouth, so chest compression only CPR. I think the other thing to say here about PPE, personal protective equipment, is that some people might not be used to wearing it. I'm sure many of you have seen videos, pictures of our NHS staff, what their faces look like after they've been wearing a full-on face fit tested mask after a long shift, and it's not pleasant. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, and you need to make sure that people aren't fiddling around with it as well. So there is a temptation, if you're not used to wearing a face covering, that you will fiddle with it. Also, gloves, don't give everybody gloves. It's got to come down to the risk assessment approach. For some people, gloves are like an invisible barrier and they'll just go around touching everything and forget to wash their hands. Next slide, please. So as the other speakers have mentioned, flows of communication is really, really important, whether it's the organisation to its people, within teams, between staff and their managers, but also from staff and volunteers to the public, liaising with our contractors, our subcontractors, and then, as Nick mentioned, talking to each other as well. So VSG peers, trade, safety associations, just making sure we're giving out consistent messages for people, really. And certainly the public, some of the feedback that I've had for sites that are already open, and surveys that have been done of people who are hoping to visit. The public really want information, so make sure it's out there. Make sure it's either in a poster form on the site or information on your website. The public want information now more than ever. And also, one of the things that's come out from discussion with peers that some people have noticed, not all, but some, is that they have had a change in visitor demographic. So it goes back to your risk control spectrum that we were talking about earlier, identifying your visitor type and making sure that you've got appropriate controls in place. So it may be people who've not visited you before, aren't used to the countryside code. So it's just something to keep an eye on when you reopen. Next slide, please. So, as we've already mentioned, social distancing is the key control measure. So you need to think about how you're going to define areas. So, for example, we've got some staff who have to work very closely to path edges. So they're changing how they do things and the time of day so that they're mainly working near the paths when the public aren't on site. So beginning of the day, end of the day. When you've thought about social distancing, you then have to think about hand hygiene, as Nick mentioned, particularly important, like in the situation in the woods where people are, not close to plumbed in hand washing and toilet facilities. So you need to think about those field situations. It's really, really easy to get bogged down in all the COVID-19 stuff and forget about all the other health and safety law that's still there. So I've just put some points on the screen, really. So statutory inspections, like your lifting equipment, pressure vessels, those kind of things, your Legionella control. There's been a lot of concern from Health and Safety Exec, Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, that buildings that have been empty, there'll be a Legionella problem if we don't control it carefully. Fire management, haves and noise. So people who are trying to get sites ready for reopening, they're really, really busy. They may be tempted to use equipment, chainsaws, brush cutters, those kind of things for longer periods than they would normally. So just keep an eye on your vibration and your noise exposure for your staff and volunteers. Working hours, welfare facilities, CDM regulations, so where you have big construction sites and those kind of things, liaising with contractors, they are all still in place, and they need to be risk assessed. You need to have good flows of communication, etc., as you would in normal time. Just to say on personal protective equipment, don't forget there's probably going to be ongoing shortages, so you're going to have to make sure you're getting your orders in well in advance. And certainly where you have staff like this chap here, who's wearing PPE for other tasks, you need to make sure that they've still got those. So if you're chainsawing, if you're spraying around paths and things, make sure that they've still got their PPE. Next slide, please. Okay, so in terms of our visitor safety, we've done a lot of the things that are in the VSG document. So management of queues, particularly at admissions and toilets. We've gone cashless, so you have to pay by card. We've minimised handling of items, so things like a lot of our hides have bird ID guides in them, so taking those out because they present a risk. Not having audio guides, removing or turning off interactive features, those kind of things. Also think about, what if somebody arrives on the day and says, actually I want to renew my membership, or I want to become a member. Now clearly that is something that we want to encourage, but it needs to be done safely. Normally it would be done with a member of staff or volunteer in very close quarters, so we need to think about how we're going to do that differently. Give them a central phone number, for example. Clear communications for the public, so we've actually got in place now a visitor code of conduct that's based on the countryside code plus a few other bits. That's all on our website. What to expect during your visit, what's open, what's not, so clear communications with people, really. We've decided to do pre-booked tickets. Some people are doing timed tickets. There's no right or wrong with it, really. So for the staff and volunteers, things like perspex screens at admissions, potentially PPE for some people who are meeting and greeting in an indoor space. How are you going to move people through your buildings and get them outside as soon as possible? How are you going to hold meetings, staff meetings? Is it going to be outside? Is it going to be a smaller group as possible? Electronic, all of these things. Next slide, please. And that's me done. Thank you very much. I think there's a Q&A session coming up later, so we can answer any questions that have come through. Thank you.
That's great, Adele. Thank you very much. And you've sparked loads of discussion and questions on the question panel there. So great to see those all coming through. And thanks again, folks, for your questions. We'll try and get those answered either during the course of the webinar or at a Q&A session at the end, as Adele mentioned there. And great to see plenty of discussion as well going on in the question panel. And again, that really is that collaborative strength of VSG, which is fantastic. More about that later with VSG peer groups, etc. that will come out of this webinar as well. Okay, well, we're going to move into our final session then on the detail of the guidance, and I'm going to pass back to Nick. Are you there, Nick? Your microphone off mute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. We can hear you now. That's great. So we're going to get your title slides on screen. We're going to get you on screen, and I'm going to pass over to you, Nick, to talk about outdoor visitor infrastructure. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. You'll be pleased to know I've actually turned off all the phones in my house now, so you won't be treated to the sight of me diving across the room. Before I start on this, actually, it's quite a salient point to mention some of the comments, because while I was listening to Adele, we've been chatting to some people in the chat section. It's great to see people asking questions, and obviously I've just given my opinion to a couple of questions. I think one of the main things I think people are concerned about is, what do you do if visitors don't behave, if they don't follow the social distancing rules, and where does organisational responsibility end and where does personal responsibility end, that kind of stuff. And I have a very sort of particular view on that, and I think providing that we as organisations and landowners and land managers, providing we've stepped back, done our risk assessment, and we've done what we believe everything that's reasonably practicable to make our sites safe and to enable social distancing or physical distancing, and that's it. And the rest of it is over to the individual. And we shouldn't try to be all things to all people. We're not here to be the world police. We're simply doing the best we can. I think that goes back to my bit about us feeling confident, saying, look, we're doing everything we can. That's the best we can do. And that's it. The rest is up to wider society and the people out there. Okay, in terms of visitor infrastructure, there's a whole raft of stuff in the VSG guide, so I won't go into it in huge detail. There's lots of technical, very detailed questions people have about, do I leave gates open or not, or do I scrub down parking barriers and all kinds of stuff. So I wasn't going to talk about that. What I was going to do, I thought I'd show you how we've interpreted it at one of our sites and just give you a feel for how we've sort of gone about looking at visitor infrastructure. And by that sort of thing, we mean things like boardwalks and footpaths and all the rest of it. Dave had some very good pictures in his presentation and ideas about mowing paths and widening them. And that's the kind of thing that we in the Woodland Trust are doing for each site. We're asking our site managers and our estate staff to go out, have a look at it and think, bearing in mind the risk matrix I mentioned earlier on, how developed is it? How much responsibility do we have? How far do we have to go? And therefore, is there any changes that are reasonably practicable that we can make to our risk assessment? So, for example, if we're going to get a path mown, let's mow it wider. Or if we can't mow it wider because of ecological reasons, are there sections where we can put in wider bits so that people can actually stop and allow others to pass? Do we need to put up signs? Do we need to increase the number of footpaths? Is it possible, if it's within expense range and we can afford it, do we need to widen boardwalks? That kind of thing. So that's what we're talking about, and we're doing that for each of our sites. So each site is getting an up-to-date view. What do we do about it as we go along? An important message in all of this is we haven't, and I don't think anybody else needs to charge out and try and do everything at the same time. So like I said before, going back to the matrix, that's a very useful tool for deciding, actually, I'm going to focus on this site because I know it has high foot traffic and lots of people, it's easily accessible, it's got a car park, it's developed, etc. I'm not going to worry about that site over there because hardly anybody goes to it, it's quite difficult to get to, it's not developed, and so on. So it's that decision-making process is what we're going through at the moment. And I just sort of share one particular site with you. So first slide, please. What I just mentioned there is this is what we're aiming for, really. Same general principles, whether you're indoors or out. We should be enabling social distancing or physical distancing. So wherever we possibly can, make alterations or adjustments to allow people to stay apart. We should inform people, so notices, floor markers, stuff like that, and we should enable hygiene. So if you have visitor hubs or centres or whatever, there should be a plentiful supply of soap and water and all the rest of it. But again, going back to the point in the chat forum, it is then up to the individual to make use of that, and we're sort of not the hygiene police, realistically. Next slide, please. What we've just been talking about there, it's about making your own decisions. And as I said before, we in the Woodland Trust, we're looking at each individual site, we're thinking about the risks, thinking about the changes we should make, and our estate team are doing that based on the risk control spectrum. So that just gives you an idea of sort of where we are and what we're doing. Next slide, please. What I've been saying before, like I said, sites in the middle of nowhere, little if any intervention. You don't need to do too much. More accessible high foot traffic, they may require more. And these decisions all landowners can make. And like I said, I'll give you an example of what we've been looking at with our Skipton Castle site. Next slide, please. Okay, Skipton Castle is quite a well-developed site. You can basically push a buggy or pushchair into it. It's right in the middle of a large tourist attraction, large tourist town right next door to Skipton Castle. It's a Visit England accredited site, and it has a variety of features in it. As you can see, the footpaths are quite wide. It's a very pretty wood. It's an ancient woodland. We have sculptures and art installations in there. There's water bodies and ponds and weirs. It's a really, really very attractive wood, and it's very, very popular. Next slide, please. You can see there, like I said, it's quite a well-developed site. So it's an ancient woodland, but it's right next door to the town of Skipton and right next door to a very nice castle, very easily accessible, very popular with visitors. And you can see the sort of the conurbation, the civilization that's right next to it. So it is probably what a site we've given a bit of priority to in terms of thinking about how do we manage the COVID-19 risk. Next slide, please. Again, gives you a feel for what's sort of there. You've got visitor infrastructure, you've got interpretation boards, you've got signs, you've got gateways and all that sort of stuff. And as I said, it's accredited by Visit England, so it gives you a feel for what we're actually looking at. Okay, next slide, please. Again, gives you a feel for sort of what visitors find as they come in. That's a willow sculpture. There's other willow sculptures around the site, including a horse and various other different creatures and things like that. Next slide, please. I think when we actually look at this site and when we sort of look at it, we think, well, okay, what's reasonable? So it's got high foot traffic, lots of people, easy to get into. You can walk straight out of the town centre to get to it. What are the risks? And the reality is, I mean, I think it's reasonable to expect visitors to take care of themselves, and COVID-19 is no different to any other hazard, and that's one of the main principles of sort of the VSG. And when we actually looked at it, you know, we're not going to go around, we're not going to leave all the gates open, we're not going to go around, there's a big set of wrought iron gates, we're not going to go around spraying those with disinfectant on an hourly basis and scrubbing them. It's just not reasonably practicable. And in Skipton, we've actually only got one intervention. Out of all of that site, with all of that infrastructure, there's only one thing that with our risk assessment, we've decided to actually make a change on. And that is, if you look at that picture on the right-hand side, there's a raised, quite long walkway that goes actually from the town centre all the way into the wood. In places, it's about 15 or 20 feet up over water. It's made out of stone, so there's not much we can really do about it, not much we can do with it, and it would be a social distancing problem because if you got to the middle of it and bumped into another crowd of people, you actually couldn't get past each other whilst remaining an appropriate distance apart. Now, you sort of look at that, you think, okay, well, what can we do about that? And what we've actually done is we've put signs up and we've made it a one-way system, because there's numerous ways in and out of the wood. So we've made this into a one-way system, informed the public with signs saying, you know, please, if you go this way, go in this way, but don't come out this way, one way only. And if you look on our website, you'll see that we've put a note on there letting people know this is the case. So next slide, please. And you can see there, that's the website notice that lets people know there is a, you know, there's a change actually on that site. But that's actually all we've done. There's another pinch point in Skipton, which is a little narrow bridge. We haven't done anything with that, because if you actually look at that picture, people can make their own decisions. You can see if somebody's coming the other direction, you can step back, you can allow them to pass, and then you can go on your way. So that's the only actual action we've taken. That's on one of our really busy, really popular sites. So, you know, we haven't gone around as a big stone bench. We're not going to start disinfecting that or cleaning it or anything like that, because we expect people to follow the hygiene advice, which is don't touch your face or mouth, and to wash your hands before you eat, drink, or do anything else. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach. So that's kind of how in the Woodland Trust we're approaching our risk assessment to all of our sites, and that's kind of our approach to it. So next slide, please. Like I said before, I mean, other changes that people could make, and this is entirely up to you, it's entirely down to your risk assessment, is if you look at the site and think, actually, it's reasonable for me to cut this path wider or cut this vegetation back, I can. If it's reasonable to lower a hedge next to a stile so people can see if others are coming and going, doesn't cost a great deal, that's the kind of stuff you can actually do. I think we only make changes, and I would advise other people to only make changes if you would be clearly putting people at risk by not doing so. So Skipton Castle is a really good example. If we hadn't made that into a one-way system, we probably would have been putting people at risk, because visitors to the site for the first time wouldn't have known that halfway down they might bump into somebody, etc. So by putting in that one-way system, putting some signs up, that's us doing a reasonably practicable action. But what we're not going to do is replace the entire walkway or spend tens of thousands of pounds re-engineering it to widen it or anything else, because that wouldn't be reasonably practicable. So that's kind of our approach, and that's kind of my advice in terms of all countryside infrastructure. It's about individual risk assessment, stepping back, looking at it, thinking what changes can I reasonably make, and then being happy with that, and also then expecting wider society to take reasonable care of itself as well. Okay, I think that's the last slide. So one more.
Yeah, that's Gina. Thank you very much. Thanks very much indeed. And there's been a great wealth of questions coming in across the question panel overall. The presentations. The presenters have had an opportunity to answer some of those, but not them all. So we're going to do a quick Q&A session now. Dave, are you there? Dave Liddy? Just make sure your microphone is off mute. And if all the presenters could actually just turn their microphones off mute, then I can come to you for each question. Are you there, Dave? Oh, well, I'll move to Adele then for the next question. Hopefully we can get Dave back online. There's a few good questions for him. Adele, are you there? Okay.
Yes.
Great. There was a question came in there around how you manage. You talked about adaptations you were making for your site. One of the questions came: Are you making any special allowances for those with special requirements, a disability, for example, with regards to queuing at the site?
Oh, with regards to queuing, I haven't actually thought of that. One of the things we have been looking at is if people have face masks on, that's really hard for lip readers. So that's something that's been brought up that we're working on, but I haven't specifically thought about queue management. In terms of our admissions points, we are going to have staff and volunteers just sort of welcoming people. It's like a meet and greet role, making sure that they're queuing, answering any questions before they go in. So I think certainly for us, if we saw somebody who was very frail, for example, who was in the queue, I think we would just get them to the front of the queue. But that is going to take manpower to do that. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question. I'm going to give that some more thought. Thank you.
No, it does indeed, and it shows this situation particularly is every time you think you've got it sussed, something else crops up. So no, it's your very honest answer there, and I think everybody's in the same position. Dave, I think you've got your microphone sorted out there, have you?
Yeah, I hope so. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. That's great. So one of the questions that came in on your section, Dave, was just can you provide a bit more information or a bit more thought, a bit more opinion on how do you deal with sites that you can't physically close? You mentioned a number of approaches for different sites, but what advice would you be given to people who can't physically close sites?
You've got to accept it is what it is, and we can do our best as an organisation. And I know there are people in the organisation who think all of our sites are physically closed, but I know it's absolutely not true. It wouldn't be reasonably practicable. It would cost an arm and a leg to close some of our sites. Particularly, we've kept the forests open. You know, we want local people to be able to enjoy their connection with the countryside, and so it's our sites, our recognised sites, and particularly our facilities that are closed. But when you're, as I showed in the Aberherne slide there, we didn't really want to start taking a load of a concrete bollard 6 miles up a single track road just to cut off 4 car parking spaces. We put up a sign, we said it was closed, and we expect people to think, oh, this site's closed, I'll go somewhere else. So you've got to adopt a sense of reasonableness, you know, and that's the sort of dialogue that Nick was making there.
Okay, thanks very much, Dave. And just leading on from that, then, if you have had sites where there's potentially maybe being, you talked about antisocial behaviour, interesting visitors, etc. What's your experience been, and I'll come to the rest of the panel on this as well, what's your experience been with dealing with local police, etc.? Has that been supportive, or have you any, again, opinion or ideas of how to make that more effective?
The attention of the police has been very hit and miss, and we've done some very good partnership working because they've and we've been able to direct their attention to other antisocial behaviour, particularly with motorbikes, because they've not been rushed off their feet in other places. Done some good partnership working, but then all of a sudden it's a bank holiday, and the police are taken elsewhere, you know, to stop the influx of the ill-informed marching over the border. So it's good when you can get it, and it usually relies on the having good relationships in place beforehand. So you know, if you've never spoken to them, perhaps now's not the time, but it's something that you ought to start building on in the future. What do other people think?
Yeah, Nick, any thoughts on that one? I know you've quite a few sites open. Any thoughts on that one of dealing with local police?
Yeah, I was just actually chatting about that in the chat bit. I think pretty much at any site you'll have antisocial behaviour and misbehaviour, whether there's a pandemic on or not. I know we do in the trust, and what we tend to find is where we've got good relations with the local police officers generally, so we actually get in touch with them, we contact them, we form a relationship with them, we get better responses. And I think that's something I probably encouraged during the pandemic. So I think having close contact with your local police, taking the time to get to know them, and then, yeah, using them. People have been asking questions in the forum, if people aren't cooperating and aren't following social distancing rules, should I inform the police? And I think yes, the answer is definitely. I think the sidebar to that, though, is the message I'd give to our staff and volunteers is their safety always comes first. So if people aren't socially distancing, if they aren't following the rules and you're there on site, then, you know, politely reminding them is fine, but we're not the social distancing police, and if they feel at risk, they should just get out of there and go, and like you said, dial, was it 101, the non-emergency number, and report it to the police. Some areas you can actually, like in West Mercia where I live, if you go onto the police website, you can actually automatically report social distancing failures online, and you just put in either a grid reference or a postcode, and you can literally drop a pin on a Google map and say, you know, people in this area aren't cooperating, and the police do then respond. We've actually seen the police coming out into Ironbridge Gorge where I live responding to that sort of thing, and you know, moving people on.
Okay, thank you, Nick. Adele, I'm going to come to you. No, I'm not going to come to you next one. Nick, I'm going to come to you, back to you for this one, actually, because I'm conscious, Adele, a lot of your sites aren't open yet. But
can I just add something really quickly about
of course,
the
please
fleet?
do.
All I was going to say is, yes, same as the other speakers, but I have found the wildlife crime officers in the various police forces across the UK have been absolutely fantastic without fail. So if you have wildlife crime going on, definitely report it.
Thank you, Adele. The next question is always a hot topic when it comes to VSG or ORN or any of the networks that we're involved in is litter. And we've obviously seen an influx of new, in inverted commas, visitors to our sites over the last couple of weeks, couple of months, which should be welcomed and should be an opportunity for us to address as we move forward. But with that has brought a litter issue. Nick, any again ideas or opinions of how you've dealt with the challenge? And I'll come to Dave next on that one, but Nick, I'll come to you first.
Yeah, I've been talking to the estate staff. Basically, it's a combination of things, and so we've increased our bills and our expenses of our contractors. Lots of site clearance going on, lots of fly tipping being cleared up and got rid of. Obviously, that's had to wait until the tips have been open and this sort of thing. So that's sort of happening now. One of the things we are doing as well is our volunteering team. The first sort of volunteers we've activated are our volunteer wardens. So our English volunteer wardens became active about 2 weeks ago. Followed by Northern Ireland and eventually Scotland and Wales. They'll come back as well. Those single roles, part of what they've been doing has actually just been litter picking and all the rest of it. We're also looking at retasking volunteers potentially. So we have a large group of volunteers all over the UK that do sort of practical work, coppicing, tree felling, building things, that kind of stuff. They aren't going to be doing that in the short term because they're a group, so you can't bring a group back in. But we're looking at effectively creating socially distant volunteers who can go around and help with general maintenance in the wood. So that'll include things like litter picking and clearing stuff up and sorting the sites out. So I think there's two things there: is repurposing what you've already got in terms of manpower and person power, and also being prepared to actually pay a bit more, unfortunately.
Okay, Dave, any thoughts on that one?
Well, Nick makes a good point, and you've got to remember we're still all closed here in Wales, and so we've not met that particular obstacle yet. In general, a lot of our sites are only somewhere between lightly and moderately developed anyway. In which case we generally try and avoid putting in litter bins, and we've gone even further down that line. We're trying to put the responsibility for that on the visitors, and we've done some work with local community councils, and they're saying, you know what, you're right. Yeah, you don't need more bins, do you? And so, through some of our external partners, we're trying to get a groundswell of support on that. More heavily developed sites, I think Nick makes a good point about repurposing some of your staff. If we've got cafe staff and we are not operating the cafe at full capacity, then we'll be able to find some other jobs with them. We'll have to think about risk assessing that and what PPE might be required, and how to make that a less onerous job. We're already thinking about, we have litter bins on our some of our bins to stop the litter blowing around the place. Those are going to obviously have to go. Those are going to be a touch hotspot, and then we're thinking about opening the emptying the bins rather more frequently. But it's because we only do that on our heavily developed site. It's not a problem we have across the piece.
Great, Dave. Thank you. From litter to another perennial hot topic of toilets. So again, the question coming in then, if reopening toilets is deemed unsafe because they're too narrow potentially, are things like portaloos being considered, or any other ideas of how that might be approached? Again, come to you first, Nick, and then I'll come to you, Dale, second on that, and how you're planning to do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's in terms of enabling social distancing, toilets can be tricky because by their nature they're quite small spaces. And I think probably there's two parts to this really. If you absolutely cannot enable social distancing with something like a toilet, then you can't open it. That's the plain simple truth. I think usually you probably can. There is more information in the guidance, but you can do things like making sure, providing that it's decent to do so, you can leave the outside door open, actually secure it open with a bolt or a chain so it can't be closed, making sure that there's good ventilation, taking cubicles out of service so that people are kept apart, all those kind of things. And if not, then portaloos, yeah, absolutely. I think portaloos are fine. You will just need to think about having a hygiene regime for them as well. In some respects, portaloos are actually easier to clean because you can literally just sort of open the door and throw a bucket of disinfectant in, and you've got a clean toilet effectively. So yeah, variety of things. Use portaloos, enable social distancing, and if you can't, then unfortunately you have to keep them shut.
Great. Adele, any thoughts on that one?
I have to say that I think for many of us, we've spent a disproportionate amount of time thinking about toilets. It has been really, really difficult. But yeah, echoing what Nick says, so looking at whether you can do social distancing, enhanced cleaning regimes. I think it's also important to make sure that you've got support and well documented risk assessments for your cleaning staff, because some of them might be concerned about returning and what's going to be put in place to protect them when they're carrying out the cleaning duties. So it's just being aware of that as well.
Okay, thanks, Adele. We're going to do two last questions, or one question and one thought for the end before we move on to close. Still have nearly 200 people online, which is great. So thanks for your engagement, folks. The next question is around the engagement with local communities who obviously are in close proximity to your various sites. So again, how do you make those local communities feel at ease or feel comfortable, deal with the challenges that they might be having with visitors coming to their area? So Nick, I'm going to come to you first on that one.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge, and we have had some complaints from neighbours that more and more people are actually in the woods, etc., etc. I think it goes back to sort of what I was saying before about assessing each site and taking one site at a time as you start to look at them, and thinking about are there existing tensions? How do the neighbours get on already? What sort of relationship do we have with them? I think communicating with them is important, letting them know what you're actually doing. So if you are making changes to the wood, get in touch with the neighbours and say, look, we're doing this. We're widening the paths and doing whatever. You can use your websites to get information out there. So for each individual site, you can have them there. If your organisations have like central sort of call centres or contact centres, you can actually update them so they know what's going on. So people contact them and say what's happening with the wood next door, they'll actually know. And I think having good communications is key. So it's very important to make sure that if neighbours do actually have a problem, they can get in touch with the appropriate site manager or the appropriate estate manager or whatever else. So I think it's a mixture of maintaining a relationship, but also maintaining communications with people and doing the best you can. Like I said, it's important to step back. We shouldn't go down the avenue of thinking, well, we're the COVID-19 police, we've got to solve every problem. In many cases, it's a question of saying, well, we can't do anything about that. Sorry.
Okay, Nick, thank you. Adele, I know you're planning about this moving ahead, but any issues with local communities in your area? And then I'll come to you, Dave, just to finish off.
No, I just echo what Nick said. Really, it's about being open and being honest and saying that we might not get it right, but this is what we're doing. This is what we're planning. Please speak to us, and just keeping up that level of communication. Really,
Dave.
Yeah, keeping up the communication. We've got a lot of local communities are well used to visitors in various proportion. We've got to be sensitive to the feelings of local communities, but equally there are other communities who they may have bought that house in that lovely place, and actually they'd rather there were no visitors ever, regardless of the scenario. And so we have to be careful in finding a proper balance in how we treat those communities, particularly when you've got more remote communities, and I can think of somewhere like Blaenau is in the heart of Wales, and you've got to make a big effort to get there, but it's a very strong local community, and it does mean that they're very sensitive to what goes on and how many visitors are in the place and the impact that they can have, both positive and negative. And so as Adele said, if we've got good communications with them, then whether we open, whether we close, it is important because if you lose touch with your local community and you fall foul of them, you know, that's not going to work for anybody in the long term. You need to be sensitive to that.
Thanks, Dave. And just one last brief thought from you each now. Quite a few questions have come in there around, we've noticed a groundswell of visitors, potentially new visitors, new segments coming into our sites over the last couple of weeks. Outdoor Recreation Northern Ireland carried out a bit of research during the COVID-19 lockdown, and 51% of people said that they intended to engage with the outdoors more regularly after lockdown than they did before. Any thoughts about how we're going to, on a more positive note, any thoughts about how we're going to capitalise on that moving forward? Any thoughts from you, Adele?
I just think it's an absolutely wonderful opportunity, isn't it? I mean, anyone who knows my organisation knows that Sir Peter Scott set it up with the primary intention of, you know, educating and engaging with the next level of the next generation of conservationists, and I think it does provide that lovely opportunity. So for us, it's about maybe changing some of our messaging or how we're getting information across, particularly as we can't do things like engagement talks. We can't necessarily have the schools coming in and engaging in those ways. So it's just, thinking about things slightly differently and welcoming those people and giving those people an opportunity, but maybe in a slightly different way.
Thank you. Any thoughts from you, Nick, on that one?
Yeah, to echo Adele, really. I mean, an interesting statistic for you, which some of you probably heard because it was on a separate call, but I think it was Natural England or English Heritage, can't remember which, anyway, it's irrelevant. They actually had ANPR cameras on their car parks, so they actually monitor the number plates of cars coming and going. And they found that sort of in the middle of the lockdown, 94% of the cars that were coming and going were unknown to them. So there are people that hadn't been to that site before, people they had never seen, which I think is incredible, really. It means, you know, almost everybody was there for the first time. We're aware of that, and as Adele said, we're sort of just trying to look at how we engage those people, how we actually maintain a relationship with them. It's a case of, I suppose, changing your ask a little bit. So it's like, well, you know, you're welcome to our site. You've been for the first time. You've enjoyed it. Would you like to help us? Would you like to get back with us? I think also it's partly about, as part of the rolling process of getting things working again, it's about looking at all different things at the same time in some respects, because what we're also doing, we're also looking at how we could go about restarting events and looking into the future, how we can we've just started restarting forest schools and things like that. So it's about all the different forms of engagement. So what can you do with social media? What can you do with people? What can you do getting back out into the woods? I think that's our approach. Okay.
Final thought from you, Dave, on that one before I pass over to Ken to bring us to close.
Sure. Well, you know, because we're further back upstream from most places in Wales, still being in red, we're concentrating on the here and now. And you know, Adele and Nick make some good points about thinking ahead. What a fabulous opportunity it will be. And because with the announcement about what's happening with schools, we know there'll be an extra week school holiday in October, and already we're thinking, well, that's a terrific opportunity. If we've got more and different people coming, we've already got a bigger holiday, and so we're going to need to think about how we capitalise on that as an opportunity. So we'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you, Dave. So Ken, you're back online with us there again, I think, by telephone.
I hope so.
You are indeed, yeah. We can hear you loud and clear. So we're going to pass over to you, Ken, for close, and I'll come back in again just before we say cheerio. So Ken, over to you.
Okay. Well, I hope people have found this a useful and informative webinar. Certainly from the VSG point of view, we can take lots from this. Not least is that throughout our work in dealing with visitors, we've noticed that everything moves smoother if there's a degree of consistency from site to site, from organisation to organisation. So I think the sharing of information that we've been able to do here will help in terms of what I detect from looking at the Q&As is a broadly common approach. looking at risk controls, there'll be different solutions. But I think Joe Public going out into the countryside and visiting our sites is likely to encounter a similar approach to managing the risk, and that I think helps in managing the visitors on their sites. I'd also urge everybody to open their sites as soon as they possibly can, because it strikes me that the first site to open is going to get the first sites that are